Welcome to the Urban Ag Business Land Access Panel. This is the first of what we hope will be several panels about urban ag business put on by the Department of Energy and Environment's Urban Agriculture Office and the Department of Small and Local Businesses Innovation and Equitable Development team. We're really excited to have an incredible set of speakers who are farming on many different kinds of land. And so I would like to quickly, we're going to start with introductions from each farm and each farmer who's with us today in telling us about how they currently grow and where they currently grow. We'll dive into a set of panel questions, and then we'll be taking your questions, both those you've already put in the chat and or in the mural. And then we'll open it up for those of you on the phone to ask questions at the end. So if you have questions while our panelists are speaking, please do put them in the chat. We will come back to them, but I invite you to keep yourself muted so we can hear all of our fabulous speakers who are sharing their time today. And so I would love to start with Mary Ackley of Little Wild Things Farm. Mary, thanks for being here with us. Can you start us off sharing where Little Wild Things is and how you farm?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Really looking forward to the discussion. I'm Mary. I own Little Wild Things Farm. We are an urban farm located in Northeast DC, and we've got 2 growing locations. We grow salad greens, microgreens, and edible flowers. And we have an outdoor location and an indoor vertical farm. The outdoor location is on Lincoln Road in Northeast. It's a small little plot located at the Carmelite Monastery. We have a little memorandum of understanding with the monastery to use their land, and we've been partnered with them for about 6 years now, ever since the very beginning when I first started the farm. And then we've got a 4,000 square foot indoor vertical farm located on Bladensburg Road, right next door to Jenks Hardware. And there we grow both soil grown microgreens, about 30 different varieties, and also hydroponic lettuces and edible flowers and herbs as well, and different baby greens. And that's a little bit about us. We, in terms of what we do, we sell our microgreens primarily direct to the consumer through about 350 member CSA style salad subscription program. So we deliver to about 300 plus houses every week all across the DC metro area. We also donate 1 share for every 20 shares that we sell. And we also sell at farmers markets and wholesale to chefs, restaurants, hotels, caterers, that type of thing. And you can also just buy direct online through our website. And I think that about covers it.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thanks again for being here. We put the link to Little Wild Things. If you want to see more photos of the farm or check out their website, it's in the chat now. And for those of you who are joining on the phone, we will be sending out links afterwards so you can follow up with all of these farms. I would love to pass next to David Rico from Sovereign Earthworks. David, would you like to unmute yourself and tell us the same questions? What is Sovereign Earthworks and where are you currently growing and how?
Holito, can everyone hear me? All right. Thank you so much for inviting me and inviting Sovereign Earthworks to be here. We are a group of trans, queer, gender non-conforming, Black and Indigenous farmers who run a mobile farming operation throughout the DMV. So our focus is around stewarding primarily traditional seeds. So seeds, we like seeds from this bioregion. So we have seeds from Virginia, from Maryland, from DC, but also we include seeds from all over Turtle Island and also Africa to steward these, like, we try to use like traditional planting styles as well. So including like intercropping, including mound building, and just trying to really like heal the soil of every space that we get into. So this how this plays out is the one of the last spaces that we tended to was the space at George Washington, right down the street from the Watergate, and on the other side of the Foggy Bottom Metro. Due to the circumstances of 2020, the students weren't able to be on campus, and so this was an opportunity for us to come in for a single season and steward the space. So that's a place where, like, you know, we have a lot of photos. We just launched our website that I dropped in the chat, and it's a place where you can check out our zine. We made a zine detailing sort of like our praxis, our ideology, who we are, and sort of like what we're doing. And this season, there's like a lot of opportunities that are opening up throughout DC. Yeah, so I think this is like supposed to be a brief introduction. So I'll try
That's
to sit
great.
there.
Thanks so much, David. And I see that we've got some questions coming through. We are going to keep our panelists moving through so we can get answers from everyone. Kate Lee, can we get a little show of what will happen if our panelists are going a little bit too long? There we go. So everyone, keep your eyes out for the leaks, speakers in particular, but thank you, Kate, for being our timekeeper. David, thanks for keeping that brief. We are going to follow up with some more. Our next panelist is Kristof from Uptop Acres. Kristof, can you tell us a little bit about Uptop Acres? Where and how do you grow?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm really excited to speak and learn from everyone else who's here. I am from Uptop Acres. We grow primarily on rooftops, primarily solely on rooftops in a soil-based system. We grow organically. We primarily operate in DC, but we also have a couple spaces in nearby Metro Maryland. And this is our fourth full growing season on the roofs. We grow a range of mixed vegetables, cut flowers. We keep bees. We grow some landscape plants that we distribute. And the way that we primarily distribute our products are through a CSA program. We have 4 different pickup locations. We sell wholesale to local grocers and to some caterers. We sell some cut flowers to local florists. And then we also have a sort of design and build side of our business where we design and build rooftop gardens for large commercial buildings as well. So that's sort of a quick rundown of what we do.
Thanks so much, Kristof. And last but not least on our panel, we have Gail Taylor from 3 Part Harmony Farm. Gail, can you introduce yourself, where and how 3 Part Harmony grows?
Sure. Hi, can you hear me okay?
We sure can.
I think I might have a bad internet connection. I'm Gail Taylor. I'm the owner-operator of 3 Part Harmony Farm. We grow vegetables, flowers, and herbs on a 2-acre property in Northeast DC.
Wonderful. Thanks. So having heard a little bit about all of these farms and where you're growing, our first big question is how you came to the spaces that you are currently growing on. So we're going to go in opposite order this time around. So Gail, we're sticking with you for a bit. How did you come to the land where you're currently farming in Northeast?
So in 2011, I took a year off from farming so that I could write a business plan to be able to start a farm in DC. And I just spent the year getting to know people here in the city. And then also I made a spreadsheet of available properties that fit my criteria and sort of just went on a land search. So the parcel that I farm on now is one that was top on my list. It had everything that I wanted. And so, I just went through a process of cold calling the property owner, and then eventually in 3 years, it took me 3 years, but eventually getting a lease on the property. And during that 3-year process, I did like a backyard style CSA. So I also rented backyards from people And I would ride my bike around to different gardens throughout the week. And then on harvest day, I would harvest from the different gardens and then give to a very small 6-member CSA. People would come to the porch of my home and pick up there until we were finally able to start in 2015 after getting the lease in Brookland.
Wow, that's incredible. So I'm going to just ask a follow-up question on that, Gail, because I know
Sure.
some of the folks on the call are in that sort of backyard growing situation. How did you find even the backyards to rent in those 3 years where you were farming in that backyard CSA?
Mostly people found me, especially the garden that was my most favorite and most productive is a corner lot on Rock Creek, Church Road and 5th Street, I think it is. The Dorothy Day Catholic Worker House that's like diagonal from the old soldiers home. People who I knew from having lived in DC since 1999, they heard that I wanted to start a farm in the city, and so they would email and call me and offer up their yards. And I really got to say no to the ones that were too far away or too small. And I just kind of hobbled it together by taking advantage of people's offers.
Wow, thanks so much for that. So next, let's head back to Kristof. Kristof, how did you find the spaces where you are currently growing?
Myself and my two business partners, we sort of had the idea that we wanted to try to start a farm in the city, and sort of were having did a similar thing that Gail did, make a business plan, try to figure out how we can make it work, and we really couldn't find anywhere at ground level that we thought could work. And so we found inspiration from a group in New York City called Brooklyn Grange, which is also a large rooftop farming organization, and thought that we could try to implement that model in DC. And so basically we went and got jobs working for a construction company that builds green roofs, so puts soil and plants on roofs, and worked there for 2 years, basically just trying to learn the industry and try to build connections. And then really just cold emailing, a lot of hours and hours of time on Google Earth, on the satellite, looking at the roofs of buildings, cold emailing a lot of buildings, property management groups, real estate companies. After 2 years, we were able to find sort of the first pilot location that was of people who were willing to work with us, and then sort of have a small proof of concept. And then from there, we sort of progressed, and we were able to find new spaces in a similar way.
Thanks so much. It's fascinating to hear this thread of just how long it takes to find those longer term spaces. And David, over to you. I know that you and your team are in the middle of some of this searching. How have you found the spaces you are currently farming in?
Yeah, thank you so much. The spaces were sort of like also the result of intensive relationships formed over the series of years. And I know that it was really the result of other people in our collective who have been really actively looking through many avenues in DC to get land. And so when you put that much energy into it over the course of several years, like different things pop up. And I think one of the hard things being in the middle of it is some things like, has been mentioned are just kind of too far, or they're just like not ideal, or like there's just like, different issues. So we're sort of in a space where we have like developed a proof of concept, and we have like developed a zine to encapsulate both the story and the identity. And we're hoping that like with the website that we just dropped today, it can provide sort of a digital platform for people to understand us and what we're doing, and then Yeah, at the moment, I think we're just kind of looking at all of the offers coming in this season and seeing what's going to be like the most ideal and good for growing and stewarding. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Mary, what about for Little Wild Things?
Thanks. It's interesting to hear these stories. I didn't know some of the details of even like Kristof's story, even though I knew some things about our fellow farmers. So I started the farm in 2014, and kind of like Kristof, I had the idea of looking for, and Gail, looking for sort of front yards and backyards. And that was not my own idea. It was based on models that I saw in other cities. And this was after thinking about other ideas. First, I'm from Detroit originally, so I did think about going to Detroit where the land price is much lower. But it was like too big of a leap not having a farming experience. I didn't really feel comfortable doing that. So I decided to start something closer to home here where I am now, or where I was at the time. And so that's how I kind of landed on looking into the urban farming models. And the one I was looking at was connecting a series of front yards and backyards. But when I looked at my whole extended network, the backyards and front yards that I could find, though I know there are some, really weren't big enough or didn't have the right sun access, et cetera. And so I just didn't find anything that would work. So I was on a run one day, and it just occurred to me that houses don't have very much land, but institutions do. So I really started looking at like, wow, this school has a lot of land. This church has a lot of land. Again, not really a new concept, but at the time, it was all I could think of. And so I just approached the monastery. I said, that looks like it might work. Saw it from the front yard, approached them, and they said no at first, but persistence is key. So it was the middle of the winter, and they said, well, we think we have some, little bit of a garden in the back. And I thought for sure it was just going to be some tiny raised beds. Wasn't going to be big enough. I almost didn't go. But I went, and lo and behold, he takes me behind the monastery, and there's just an absolutely beautiful piece of land there that one of the friars had been tending for almost a decade, but was getting too old to continue tending. So it was kind of the perfect time. Being winter, it was hard to envision what it would look like, but I decided to go for it. And we just negotiated a little informal memorandum of agreement on how we would, I would pay for the water, et cetera, and what the hours would be. And it was as simple as that. And I got started. And then as I grew, I moved more into the quick days to maturity crops because they were more profitable. And I'll try to keep this brief, but how the indoor farm came to be, because at the end of the day, now the indoor farm is absolutely the most, it is for sure the most profitable and most productive part of our farm. Although I love the outdoor farm. And finding that was very, very hard. So again, started very informally. I was taking my produce to a local neighborhood restaurant called The Pub and the People. Some of you may know, it's in my neighborhood. And they were just getting started at the time. They wanted microgreens, but they didn't want to pay a lot for microgreens because they were a new restaurant starting out. And I needed space. They had a basement. I said, let's barter. That's what we did. So I didn't pay rent at first. We built out the basement. It was 300 square feet with our racks. Quickly grew out of that. And that's when we really, though, got a foothold as a business, because I had a space that was consistent and I could really perfect my growing methods in. So then though, it really started, long journey to get to where I am now. Years and years of moving into temporary, slightly larger spaces, getting 30 days notice and almost losing my business, trying to go the commercial lease route, finding nothing. There's just no supply of like warehouse spaces. We were just a little bit too late to market, and we didn't have enough money. And so it was just really, really hard. I never took on any outside investment. I own the business by myself and have since day one. So, I've always just built it just based on our rate of growth. And so we didn't have a lot to put down or build out of space. Very last minute, about to give up again, came across through a connection, Jenks Hardware, who was a fellow family-owned business in Washington, D.C., and was interested in our model and helping out a fellow entrepreneur. And so we were able to negotiate a lease for a space that wasn't in use. So it would be it was a great additive value for them in terms of the rent. And so now we do have a 7-year commercial regular commercial lease and we pay regular commercial rates for that space. I'm really proud of that because it's hard to build a business that can withstand that, shall we say. And anyhow, we actually built it out together. He contributed to the build out and so did I. And so that's where we are today. Sorry, that was a little long, but that's a very important part of our story and it's a little convoluted.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so on that, you touched on a few pieces that I would love to ask others about. So you mentioned that your current lease is 7 years, and wondering, but after many shorter term leases. So I'm wondering for Gail, if you can touch a little bit on what is the length of arrangement that you have with your space.
Sure. Yeah, I don't have a very long-term lease on the property where I am. After the Farm Bill passed in 2014, I got my first lease in 2015, which was 3 years. And then when I went to renegotiate the next time, I asked for 10. Sort of in my mind, I was headed towards like a 99-year lease, maybe for a community land trust, you know, like in my mind, this space that I'm creating is going to live past me. But so when I asked to go from 3 to 10, they said, what about 1? So that was kind of like the wrong direction. And my original lease started in June. So I just negotiated and said, fine, I'll take a 1-year lease, but can we end it in December instead of in the middle of the growing season? So I was able to push for an 18-month lease. And then I just renegotiated again last year. And I actually went without a lease for 3 months to try to get them to give me more than 1 year because that's just absurd. So now I have a lease that goes until the end of 2023. It's pretty difficult to think about doing the kinds of investments, and I'm not anywhere at the scale that Mary is. I mean, you know, for the first like 5 or so years, maybe even 6 years that I was on that property, the biggest piece of equipment and infrastructure that I had was like a $300 Home Depot shed. So yeah, it's like a super low infrastructure place because I don't have any permanent roots set in. And it just makes it really difficult to run a business and you don't have any like long-term guarantees of being in the space. So I don't know what's going to happen at the end of this lease. I think like all properties in DC, eventually it will get sold to a developer. So I already have 1 foot outside of the city as like where I'm going to go next when they kick me out.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that's really important for those of us from district government, definitely hearing that, both on the sense of what the future of land is in the district, but also the challenges for those who do have land, of thinking about just with a short-term lease, a farm can't make those investments. And David, back over to you on this question, sort of what has your lease arrangement been with the places where you have been growing?
For us, it's definitely had to function with a variety of agreements, you know, from like very informal of like verbal agreements, you know, we're going to like via Zoom call, shake hands and say like for this season, to just some like written agreements. Yeah. In terms of like full on leasing, it's just, we're not really at that level. You know, we, like others, are like still very mobile, and that's sort of like where it's nice to work with the ancestral tradition, right? Where it's like if the you know, just focusing on the soil and creating like diverse permacultural garden spaces, seed saving, so we don't even have, so we like don't necessarily have to always keep buying seeds, bartering, trading art, pretty much just doing everything that we can to survive. Because unfortunately, like there's a lot of excitement when people like hear about our project, and everybody like seems to want to offer space to us. And in the process of like going through the details and like, I don't know, the pace of just negotiation, a lot of things follow through. And it's just, you know, unfortunately, like, or, you know, it's just, it is what it is, but we just have to be mobile. You know, we have to like move, and we have to just like build space up from place to place to place. And, you know, we're trying to get more like mobile greenhouses, mobile hoop house structures, so that like we can be then supported as we like move from space to space, year to year.
Thanks so much for that. And, you know, unfortunately, our one of our panelists who is operating on DPR, Department of Parks and Rec land, wasn't able to join us because of some situations on their farm. But I do want to flag that, you know, in a different dynamic, the process of accessing DPR land can take many years of community engagement and partnership to access that, but then has very long-term leases. And so I think that that is the trade-off of the very long upfront to having a little bit longer. Kristof, coming back around to you, this question of leases, and I know you have a bit of a different arrangement with some of the landowners. I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, basically echoing what has been said about, you know, the investment and the amount of time and resources that is needed to run any kind of agricultural enterprise, sort of is in direct contrast with land, you know, commercial property land ownership. And so basically, you know, we have a bunch of different contracts with these big buildings, and they're anywhere from 1 to 7 years, but that's sort of besides the point, because in every single one of these like boilerplate, you know, real estate contracts, it says that they have the right to give us 60 days notice, and we have to take all of our stuff off. So like the length of the lease isn't, to me, it doesn't really mean anything, because all these contracts have these clauses in them. So basically what we do is we just try to make ourselves so inconvenient to get rid of, that we end up staying. So, you know, we're up on these, we try to embed ourselves into these buildings by getting, whether they're office tenants or residential tenants, to become members of our CSA, you know, making friends with everyone from the building engineers to the security guards to the property managers. And that's like our safety net, as opposed to a lease contract. Yeah, that's sort of who we are. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that. Do others, I mean, I know that Mary, you flagged that also you had moments where you were given 30 days notice and had to vacate. Is that something that others have experienced, whether on during that backyard period of growing or in other spaces?
My lease says that it can be terminated at any time for any reason. It's a pretty precarious situation to be renting land from somebody who, in my case, the priests have owned the property for more than 100 years. And they don't really have a lot of reason to rent the property to me. I mean, I think it makes them feel good to know that vegetables are being grown on the property. It's really important to them that I donate vegetables and remind them all the time that I donate vegetables. They save money from not having their landscapers mow the property anymore. But besides that, I don't feel like I have a lot of stability, and yeah, they don't take that part out of the lease. They can kick me out for whatever reason. So I feel like that's always hanging over my head. It hasn't happened yet, but they have a lot of quirky things about our agreement. Like, I'm not allowed to be there after hours. I'm not allowed to be there on Sundays. It's not just like free carte blanche to do whatever I want. And I think this came up earlier too. I think one of the difficult things with navigating a lease with someone is that they just don't understand. Like, they don't have any idea what it takes to run a farm as a business. And so they might have demands that are completely ridiculous and absurd and make my life really difficult, but they have no idea, and it's not intentional. But, you know, at a certain point, you just feel like you're too old for this and you have to do something else.
Yeah, I hear that. And you know, knowing that there are some folks on the call who do have land and land spaces. I'm wondering, we've already heard a few of the key elements that it sounds like you would want a landlord or a property owner to know around the instability of that having leases that don't have those protections make it really hard to invest or to farm. Are there other things that you would most want a property owner or landlord to know? I'll pass that back to Mary.
I just wanted to add also that I think it's going to be really important to think differently about outdoor versus indoor versus rooftop versus different types of farming in the city, because realistically, we're going to need all those types of agriculture, and it's just so different. Like the considerations for our indoor farm, it typically takes a much larger capital investment to get it up to par, which is like a whole different ballgame. On our outdoor space, I mean, honestly, from a business perspective, I'm going to need to move off the outdoor space. I mean, there's just no way that I could ever sell my business or really, and it's terrible because I love it more than anything. It's a gem in DC, but I don't have tenure. I mean, no person would ever be able to take that space over. I have an informal agreement with the monastery. So yeah, formal agreements are important for real businesses. So making it formal, making it long enough that the person can invest or the business owner can invest. And then looking at different types of spaces, not just outdoor spaces, but also indoor spaces, especially in a densely populated urban area. We grew 18,000 pounds of food on 4,000 square feet, tiny little space that used to be a parking garage. That's a lot of food. And so I think we should really be thinking about this, but again, the investment it's not nothing. And our space is not up to par. I will say that. So if we had more, we need more resources to really build it up to what I see in other cities. Like I can see other similar farms in other cities that their space are so much nicer because they're so much cheaper. If you look at Detroit or other places.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I do think it's really quite a special thing that we have those of you panelists who are growing in so many different ways. So David, in your experience, are there things that you would most want to let a landowner know before entering into an agreement with them, or for them to be thinking about as they're considering bringing farmers onto their land?
Yeah, thank you. I guess for us, like our biggest priority is like long-term access to land. And, access to land in general, just like in freedom, without strings attached, and letting us do the style of farming and letting us do like the things that we need to do without trying to, create the story of like what's going to be there, like allowing it to breathe. But really what we're looking for right now is like a nice, stable, long-term space within Washington, D.C., where we can like establish our hoop houses and really grow out the season. That would be just such a huge blessing to this project. And we're also just in deep need of resources. Honestly, we haven't been paying ourselves in a year. We've been held together with like blessings and hope. And it's like just at a difficult point. And so like if you follow our social media, like some of our members are truly, truly hurting in truly, truly difficult situations. And so like we definitely need just like that investment to help us get over this next hump as easily as possible. And because we totally believe that the farming spaces and the communities that we steward and create are unique and beautiful and deserve to be in every city. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have so many wonderful questions coming in. And I think one really big one, and I know that this was a question that came up in the Food Policy Council's Racial Equity and the Food System in DC series last year, was a question around racial inequities and racial disparities in land access for urban ag in DC. We know that there are. We know that those have been for many different reasons, but I'm wondering how you have seen those play out in your experience. Yes, let's see. Gail, do you have thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that it's one of those kinds of things that exist in our white supremacy that's hard to like put your finger on this one thing or this one time. I mean, is it true that doors don't open for me in the same way that they open for Kristof? Yeah, that's totally true. Like, I can't imagine going to a building and asking somebody if I can plant on their roof. I don't know, they wouldn't open the door in the first place. Those kinds of doors just don't open for me in the same way. Every single garden that I grew on, and including the place where I have a lease on now, all of those came because of connections that I had from the work that I had done before as an activist in DC. I don't have anything, I didn't do anything that just like came from cold calling a random stranger. Access to markets, access to land, access to capital, access to resources are all, it compounds. And it's always hard, even to get into a farmer's market. I had trouble getting into a farmer's market last year, and I had to call Kate because the market manager was trying to say that we couldn't come to their market, and it was totally racial discrimination. And then, yeah, I ended up at this, like, the colored people's bus like waiting area. We were like on the outside of the market for the whole year. Like literally they would put the barricade around us, and we were on the outside of the market. Yeah, I don't know. It's the kind of thing that happens every day in this country, and I guess you just get used to it.
Thanks for sharing that experience, Gail.
Well, and not only, if I may, Caroline, sorry, not only that, Gail, but you were saying that you were having to so often pay fees that were the same as those who were vending, not just distributing.
So they didn't let us inside the market. They wrapped the barricade around us, but then when it came time to pay the fees, they wanted us to pay the same percentage as everybody else. I don't know what to say. That's life in America.
And I think as Felicia's saying in the chat, this is not something, certainly all of us on the call, Kate Lee in the Office of Urban Ag, our team, while we recognize that those are the realities, don't want to get used to it and want to recognize that this is not acceptable, your experience at the farmer's market, nor the experience that you've had with regards to land access.
Well, there's just like, for me, there's two strategies that I can take. If I happen to know somebody in power, I can call them, and that's helpful, right? Like I can call Kate. I know Kate, you have an in. Or like my other strategy, which is my majority response, is just to opt out of the system. Like I feel like one of the things that I've done from the beginning, and even like the first year that I started the farm, I also started a farmer co-op. And so everybody who knows about Three Part Harmony Farm knows that our story is like always working with majority BIPOC and, non-binary folks. Like I always will opt to work with Black farmers first and foremost. The multi-farm CSA that I have been running for almost 10 years, we never worked with farms that were owned by cisgender white men because you don't need it. Like we are creating our own economy and you have everywhere else. So that's sort of just been like my go-to, is to make our own world.
Thanks for that, Gail. And David, I saw your response to that. I know a huge part of Sovereign Earthworks has been creating that space, both for people of color as well as for queer, trans, and non-binary folks. Do you have any thoughts you want to add to this? And then I want to name that I have seen the question in the chat that we would like to pass this to hear also from Mary and Kristof. But David, what would you like to share?
Yeah, I mean, it's like the deep-seated colonial mindset is difficult to combat. I mean, it's like, it's the very like basic reality is that like my partner like is received less like well than I am sometimes. And it's like pretty much just an issue of presentation. And like, it's just, when we go through spaces, it's evident how we're seen as othered or different. And it's this sick game that we kind of have to play where in some spaces we're not special enough, right? And we've been told that like as a queer, trans, like POC farming space, that's already kind of been done in 2020. And so like we need to somehow then create like a specific narrative that differentiates us from other similar organizations. And then on the other end, you know, there's like all the access to the land and the money, but it's like, you know, you look at these bills and these places, and it's just like these incredible amounts of like legal walls that we have to get through, which we're like navigating, right? Which we just do, you know, you grin and bear it. But at the end of the day, it's like through this whole process, like we're somehow then doing better than our other community members, right? And that's like, I think the hardest fact to swallow at the end of the day is that then like the folks, you know, because we're well on our way to get, you know, an actual nonprofit legal status, right? We are like in that the realm of legal recognition under the United States, and that is like a protective and like valuable asset that like can allow people to, you know, understand how to navigate us, you know. And it's like not only are we trying to fight for ourselves, but we're also trying to fight for folks like, you know, some of our partners include the like DC Fridge Collective and Kyanite Kitchen, who are just so busy out there literally putting food and community in the streets, like in the neighborhoods, that they don't have like the resources or time to go for like the legal kind of you know, money pockets, you know, land pockets, because there's millions of dollars, there's thousands of acres, they're all over. You just have to know where they're at and like poke the right pockets. And so it's like accessing those pockets is really a difficult game. And then it's sad to realize like there's a lot of people who can't even play the game, you know, so you feel like you're kind of on autopilot trying to represent like some weird, strange metaphysical identity of like community. And that's like difficult to do as like a small community-based organization.
Thanks so much, David. And so on this, you know, we know and also want to name that we are all also on Indigenous land, and this very question of land access and land ownership is in counter to the idea that all land that is owned in the district is stolen land. So naming that and thinking about different ways of owning and being on land, I want to move to some of these questions around land trusts. And I know that the thanks, Brenda. Yes, specifically on Piscataway land. And so I want to pass to Kate Lee from the Office of Urban Ag to talk a little bit about what's happening in the district around land trusts.
Hi, everyone. In addition to working at the Office of Urban Agriculture, I also co-chair the DC Food Policy Council Urban Ag Working Group. So Chris Bradshaw from the Executive Director of Dreaming Out Loud and I co-chair that group. And you know, it's a wonderful place to really advocate for policy change in the district. The group has set forth a number of priorities over the last few years, many of which we've, oops, that's my timer, but let me actually reset it for myself so I don't hog the mic myself. Excuse me. Been successful in advocating for a number of policy developments in the city, including the creation of my office, the creation of a grant opportunity that just closed in the district. And our 2021 priority is a focus on researching the development of an agrarian land trust. There are no farmers in the district that own the land on which they are farming, and that is problematic. And you know, and this is tied up in a long history of excluding, like, policies that actively excluded people of color, Black people from land ownership, from the wealth generating opportunities of land ownership. And as we see rampant gentrification and development in the city, it is more, there are many people who are very interested in seeing this land be preserved. So we are working both both really to understand what this takes. I think, you know, a number of questions that I've noticed in the chat are about the government taking on this kind of work. Typically, that's not, there aren't a lot of models for how that works. There may be some quasi-government agencies that participate with nonprofit organizations, but with community land trusts, what we really want is community ownership. We want to actually get the government out of it. We see a number of great farms, Kelly Miller, Common Good Farms, who are farming on city land, who are spending their time and energy and resources to put investments into city land. Wangari Gardens is probably another great example of that, and yet never stand to benefit for any protections on that land, or much less any long-term wealth-generating opportunities. So we are still learning. We're still in our nascent stages of understanding what this would look like. The value of, we need to understand how we would leverage the city to give up this land, as well as private landowners. But it's something that we are taking very seriously and have committed ourselves as a group to prioritize this year.
Thanks, Kate. And I think that that ties to some of the other questions that were coming through in the chat around land ownership and purchasing versus leasing land. I know that as Kate mentioned, that there are no farmers in the district who are who own the land that they're operating on. Thus, all of our questions about leases. But in terms of one of the other questions that was asked was around soil, and such an important part of farming, and thinking about the fact, particularly when you're leasing land, not having the full picture of what may have happened on the land before. And so I'd like to return to our panelists to talk a little bit about if any of you would like to share soil tests. How did you test the soil, and how did you amend the soil if that was necessary? I know that I particularly want to ask Gail this question and then come back through. I know that it's a different question for the roofs you're operating on, Kristof.
So I didn't ask anyone for lease agreements until I tested the soil. The first thing that I always asked a property owner is if first I could take a soil sample and send it in. I don't have a background in doing remediation. And so I knew that I needed to find land that I could grow on that didn't have any, heavy metals or contamination. And then, yeah, I just took soil samples, and I like to send my samples to UMass Amherst. There are other labs that you can send them to, but they don't charge you extra to test for lead, and that's super important in the city. I did, even though I didn't have lead or arsenic or anything in the soil, I didn't have soil. It turns out really what I had on that 2-acre property was dirt. It was like a pH of 4.5, and there were no earthworms. So I mostly spent the first 3 years just building soil, which was fine and possible. And yeah, important. But for me, the most important thing was making sure that it wasn't contaminated. And everybody needs to do that. Nobody can grow in DC unless you test the soil. I'm always surprised when people ask that question. It's not a question.
Thanks for that, Gail. David, what's been your experience in the soil?
Similar to Gail, we really only grow food in spaces that come with some sort of guarantee that the soil is safe. That being said, like, it's a colonial system, and like what's necessarily safe by like some standards isn't, you look at it and it's filled with like pill bugs, and why is there pill bugs there? It's because there's like some sort of like metal, it's like, if you can read how nature's reacting, then, I don't know, there's like different ways you can read soil health. And then I think another issue that we're like facing is just this idea of like what a farm is, right? A farm, which is rows and like structures and squares and lines. And so when we come with intercrops and mounds and we build on top of soil, and when we like don't necessarily take all the crops out at the end of the season, right? Because we understand that there's mycorrhiza and that there's different things happening on a microbial level And so like the idea of just ripping things out season after season, like destroys the whole structure that we're trying to build. Yet people have in their mind that what we're doing is messy, it's dirty, it's unprofessional. It's like, you know, it's a jungle. It's like this or that. But with like really negative eyes, you know, and they just like, we've definitely had to just like stand our ground when people tell us like rip all that out, you know, after the end of the season, and they're so displeased with how the space looks and giving us all these like sort of corrective, you know, it feels like you're in school, right? You know, you got to do all these tasks to get out of the space. And it's like, in doing those tasks, I'm going to destroy the very thing that is the gift to you, you know, right? Because we came here and it was like crabgrass and pill bugs. And like we spent the time of like ripping that all out, and that like really isn't that fun. And it like hurts your body, you know, and we do it by hand because we really didn't have like a budget for tools. You know, we borrowed tools and we used sticks and we like used hands and rocks and bricks, and like, you know, when it came to getting crabgrass out of the ground and seeds in, we used whatever was on hand. And like in doing that, you know, you fall into this racial category too, because you'll always be under that lens. And then like my last thought is that like when we talk about like land and land acknowledgements and being on like Piscataway territory, and we talk about decolonization, the whole idea is to give land back, right? It's not to lease land back. It's not to like, you know, kind of like manipulate land back. It's something that's like truly, I want to like, I acknowledge the wealth that I own isn't necessarily acquired through just means, and that I should share wealth, you know, in a way that other people can generate wealth, because we know what wealth is, and it isn't just living from grant to grant, paycheck to paycheck. It's having enough abundance, it's having a trust and organization that we can like comfortably live, you know, and have enough, you know, at the fringes that we can be so prosperous and opulent and joyous, like all can share in. But that's not what people want. You know, they want you to survive. And that's kind of the line.
Thanks. So there's a lot happening in the chat, and both celebrating what our speakers are saying, also talking about tool sharing, some tool sharing resources, the soil testing resources that Gail mentioned. So again, for those folks on the phone, we will be sending out these resources afterwards. So we've had a few questions come in about the economics. Just as you were saying, David, what does it look like to have business farm organizations that are able to support and employ folks? And so I want to ask, one of the questions that came in the chat earlier was, how long did each of your farms operate before breaking even or making profits? And we heard earlier in the conversation just how long it took to be able to access land. And so asking each of you sort of how long it took to have a business that you felt confident in many of the stories, leaving those other jobs and being able to farm full time. So Kristof, for Uptop Acres, what was that process like to getting to a point where you were, as someone asked in the question, breaking even or making profits?
Hopefully it's this year. I mean, this is the first year I haven't had at least one, normally two other jobs while working on Uptop Acres. So, and I'm sure that that's a familiar experience to everyone else who tries to grow on a commercial scale in DC and I mean everywhere. So yeah, hopefully it's this year. And yeah, I mean it's all been sweat equity. It's all been all of our own money that we've been putting in. So I mean, hard to quantify when the breaking even actually is. But you know, from a business X's and O's, hopefully it's this year.
Thanks for that. Mary, what about for you in Little Wild Things? Oop, you're still muted.
Sorry, I got too comfortable there. Very, very similar, but I would just say that I think it's that way for every small business, not just farming. Like any small business, you start from a seed, so to speak. no pun intended, takes a long time to grow and a lot of hard work. So if you talk to, any other small business owner, I recognize we're not all running the farm necessarily in the same business way, but so if you talk about like my initial investment, so small. I started the farm on the weekends. I had a full-time job the entire time for the first 4.5 years. But I paid back my initial investment in 3 months. So we were rolling, but that's without paying myself. Like I didn't need to subsist off of the farm. But we did start selling product right away, and we paid back the initial investment and then just tiny little bits of quote unquote profit, which I would not be able to have if I didn't have the privilege of having another job. So again, this is all like rooted in my privilege of being able to do this and spend my time doing this. But anyhow, just growing it very slowly and reinvesting those things over time. There were times where I had to loan the company more money, significantly more money over the 5 years. Thankfully, I have finally been able to pay all of that back. And last year, almost 2 years ago now, I did leave my full-time job, which was in the Foreign Service. And I have been supporting myself totally on the farm since then. I'm really proud of that. And this year, I think I'll be able to both pay myself a salary that I can actually live on in DC, and also have a little bit of profit left over, in theory, hopefully. But really, I'm really like, it's been a lot of hard work. So, and just like everybody on here.
Thanks, Mary. Gail, I saw you nodding during that. What's been your experience?
The same. And like what Mary said, this is not a story about people who own farms. This is what it means if you want to start a small business. And I think, one of the things like everybody is saying is, I also leveraged all of my privileges in being able to do this thing, to have this hobby. I also still have a job. So I'm on salary at a nonprofit organization that does sustainable agriculture. And that pays all of my bills. I also lived in a house that was owned by the people who lived in it when I first started the farm. And that basically is what allowed me to be able to invest my life savings into buying a greenhouse and work for the first 4 years before the farm made any profit. And then in that year, I took that profit, and instead of paying it myself, I bought a vehicle for the farm. So I think that's one thing to remember, is just because the business makes money doesn't mean you get the money. Like Mary is saying, you invested into the business, and sometimes you loan the business money. And then the other thing is, I think it's complicated because there are other sources of revenue that your business has that are not related to the selling of the thing that you grow. And in my case, that's definitely true. We have funded 100% of our infrastructure improvements through grants and crowdfunding. So we've never done infrastructure improvements from the sale of vegetables. And I think that's really important for people to understand, because it's not possible. I don't know if that is like making people want to get into this business or not, but don't quit your job. Don't think that you're going to buy a greenhouse from selling tomatoes, and be prepared that you're going to have to invest your own money into the business.
I'll just add that I tried doing it with the most expensive crops, except for cannabis, microgreens and edible flowers. And even I couldn't do it. I did not take any grants until COVID happened at all, but I did have to fund, funded some through, but like when it came to the major infrastructure of the indoor farm, I had to pay for that with my own money. There was just no way. And that was, and that's what the most, my stuff is like totally unaffordable to most people, unfortunately. I hate to say it, but that's the only way to survive as a business. So we try to give back, but yeah, if you think vegetables, even with microgreens, you can't do it. So.
Thanks for that, Mary. So we're going to, in a moment, open this up to more questions from the audience. But Gail, I want to follow up on one of the things you said, which was around the ways that you did fund. Obviously, you said rather than paying yourself, you bought some of the infrastructure. But you also mentioned crowdfunding, which is something that the DSLBD team is really interested in how we share. And there's more thoughts in the chat around other, as you said, not selling crop revenue streams. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that crowdfunding and the other revenue streams?
Sure. Yeah, we've done 2 crowdfunding campaigns. The first one was to get a walk-in cooler, a CoolBot, in 2015, I think. And then just this past year, we raised $30,000 for solar panels, which was remarkable. I think crowdfunding is complicated because to be able to get money from the community requires some kind of access and entree to a class of people that have more money than you. And our first crowdfunding campaign, I think we hit like a third of our target. But the last one I just did last year was like strategically during this moment where people are like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that Black farmers were discriminated against. How can I support Black farmers? And so it was just this overwhelming moment of like being in the right place at the right time to start finally collecting some crumbs, to be honest. And I forgot what the other part of your question was. I've gotten a couple of small grants. I think that it's hard because we haven't talked about this at all, but there's like this nonprofit farming kind of situation in the cities, and then there's the not nonprofit. And I think, Mary, you probably, and I think Kristof too, you guys aren't a nonprofit. This is like people think that if you're not a nonprofit, you must be making all kinds of money. But that not being a nonprofit in the farming industry just means like you don't have to have a board and fill out paperwork, but you know what I mean? And then you don't have access to apply for a lot of grants, and then people can't get a tax write-off for the donations they give you. So I think there's pros and cons to that in terms of having the community financially support and then limiting the kinds of grants that you can apply to. It's a double-edged sword in this city.
100%. And we would love to have a conversation on that could potentially take another hour and a half just in getting into this. And for folks who do want to talk about that question, please do follow up with us. Kate will put that in the chat of ways to reach out. We've had incredible questions.
Excuse me. So this is Dave Brown. I was listening to what Gail was saying, and the challenge with being a nonprofit and being able to take advantage of some of the grant structure. One of the things that we chose to do when we started HCI was to set ourselves up as an opportunity zone business, and in that way, you can attract investment dollars from multiple places, so that you can leverage the tax benefit to those individuals that might want to participate or invest in that endeavor. So that might be one avenue that folks might want to take a look at if they can find a reasonable location for their operations within one of the opportunity zones in the district. I think there are a lot of them that are east of the river that might be available that they might start taking a look at. Over.
Thanks so much for that. Other questions from the audience, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. If you're not able to unmute, we will share some of the questions from the chat.
Hello, can you all hear me? Excellent. My name is Kendrick Jackson. I work with Garfield Terrace Resident Council and their rooftop farm, as well as with Hustlers to Harvesters, Wallace, who introduced himself earlier. My question is specifically for Kate Lee. I wanted to get your impression on sort of the appetite of Director Wells in regards to being able to provide more capacity building for urban farms that may necessarily not. We know, we have those farms here. I think DOE has the capacity to be able to sort of do an analysis of these farms to really see that they truly are farms, they are actual businesses, and then potentially be able to sort of have it in some level of a cohort or some what have you, rather than having urban farmers have to compete for a grant to basically duplicate services, where these farmers would have to write a grant that the agency had already sort of written and pulled down. I know recently you guys had a grant that closed for about $119,000 that was to go to a farm. there are a lot of farms that could use not necessarily $100,000 or $119,000, even $19,000 would go pretty far with some members on this call. But I wanted to get your idea of what the capacity of the director, does he seem like he's moving in that direction in regards to being able to work with building out the capacity for farms that may not necessarily be in the place or capacity wise to be able to necessarily pull down these grants, maybe because they're not nonprofits, or maybe they are for or a nonprofit and they just don't have, they have to spend more time working on their farm than they do actually pulling down the grant. So I kind of wanted to get an idea of sort of what, and again, I do know that your office is very new, your agency is new in concept on a federal and global side, but it does fill a very a much needed gap to be able to provide those resources. And I wanted to sort of see what the vision was because, again, that 119 easily could be split up amongst 6 or 7 farms that would greatly appreciate it and be able to help build that capacity. And I'll mute myself for the answer.
Cool. Hey, Kendrick, thanks for the question. And to clarify, it was $118,000 and $52 in individual grants up to $25,000. So we are excited that it looks like we might be able to fund as many, it was individual grants up to $25,000. So depending on what was asked by the individual farms, we may be able to fund a majority of those, and we're very excited to do so. I am sorry to see that Brenda Perez just had to jump off the line. She is our newest employee at the Office of Urban Agriculture and has been brought in specifically to run the grant program. Thank you for recognizing that our office is new, and for a year I've been the only one here trying to take on a quickly moving and growing list of responsibilities, funding being something that really deserves its own attention. Not only city funding, but accessing federal funding as well. The USDA is, seeing a lot more momentum with their Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production. My office applied for their funding opportunity last summer. We were not an awardee, but we will continue to try to secure other funds. The director is very interested in particular in supporting nonprofit farm and farming endeavors in the district. And one thing I'm particularly interested in doing is much to like the amazing example that DSLBD has set, is really trying to break down a lot of the barriers for applying to grants in the district. I mean, there are so many hurdles you have to jump through simply just to apply, not even to be awarded. And what would it look like for us not only to remove a number of those barriers, but to your point also, I would love to, work with grants training and grants writing resources and those types of things to really break down what, the way that, or sort of the notion, breaking down the notion around like specific grant languages. There's so much formality and structure and nonsense in the way that grants, the grant world operates with incredible unrealistic expectations. Having written my first grant last year, my grant to the USDA was the first grant I've ever written in my entire life. And I just really needed a vacation after that. And I was getting paid to do it. So the expectation that others weren't, or that others would have that same capability is really unfair and unrealistic. I don't know that those grant goals are as direct with the director, but he's certainly interested in supporting nonprofit, and I am eager to use what power I have for to help create the resources for applicants.
And I had one last question. My last question was: there's a recent $4 billion portion of the COVID relief fund specifically targeting Black farmers to help pay down their debt. Is there any sort of coordination or strategy that your agency is doing to be able to help farmers within the district that may qualify for this. And if not, that's cool too. I just wanted to know if there was something we need to be on the lookout for.
Not at the moment, but to that point, the grant funding that we did just have was specifically targeted to support what the USDA deems are socially disadvantaged groups, which is basically coded language for BIPOC populations. But that was a priority of my office to designate funds in that direction. But thank you for elevating. Kendrick, I want to have a meeting with you off the side. I really appreciate your questions and would like to dig deeper in them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate and Kendrick. Any questions in the group for other farmers? I know there were a lot in the chat, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask them now.
So since I know that there were a number of these questions in the chat, so I'll try to put these together and see if anybody wants to talk a little bit about them. And you know, I think as we think about land accessing, you talked a little bit about this, Caroline, but I think, you know, as we start to push on the question of ownership and maybe collective ownership or ways in which we could approach how do we get ownership into the hands of farmers, small business owners, you know, what are the efforts that are going to need to happen and who's going to need to do that? I know that there is a lot of interest around that. And maybe if our panel or even some of our non-panel members, if someone wanted to say, like, what is one thing? You could have a whole list of things, but what is one thing that you would say might help us move closer to that goal?
You're saying one thing specifically around like setting up an agrarian land trust?
Whether it's an agrarian land trust, whether it is TOPA for small businesses, whatever that thing is, you know, to help small business owners get ownership of property and farmers to get ownership of property, what is one thing that would be helpful?
I think the group is already doing this, but find someone else who knows what to do and bring them in and just replicate that model. I think that it's completely unrealistic to try to do it on an individual level. Like the land that I farm on is going to get sold for $15 million. And if I had $15 million, I wouldn't buy 2 acres. Like I wouldn't be able to hold my head up in the farm community ever again. So the idea of owning the land that you farm on in the city is kind of absurd, really, unless it is community owned. So there has to be some land trust. But as far as I know, and the reason why I went the route that I went is because there isn't such an organization in DC right now that has the money to be able to do that. Not in housing and not raw land. So that's what we need. We need a land trust organization that has deep pockets that can start putting land into a trust.
Yeah, I agree with you, Gail, wholeheartedly. You know, in this wildest curvy, you know, hustlers, harvesters. However, you know, what I did put in the chat, really in response to an earlier statement, you know, one model that we were familiar with was the Black Panther, Elaine Brown, you know, and what the model that they're establishing out there in California, you know, they started off basically as a co-op, primarily focused on returning citizens. But again, it took a lot, you know, it took a lot for them, you know, and they had to bring in some, you know, people with big pockets, investors and so forth. And they were fought tooth and nail by those city local, you know, officials, you know, who actually looked like us, you know, who were Black. And they were, you know, they were some of the main characters, you know, trying to stop that effort, you know. So, you know, there's a lot to learn from that. I think that's a model, as well as, you know, individuals that we should be connecting with, you know, to learn from.
Just to add to that, part of the year when I was doing the land search too is, you know, when I mapped out available land that met the criteria for farming, the problem in DC is that a lot of it is government owned already.
Exactly.
And so like actually the best place for me to have started my farm that was within walking distance of where I lived is the Armed Forces Retirement Home. And that's federal land, and they are either not going to give it up or they're going to sell it to a developer that they've been talking about doing for many years. So somebody wrote privately to me, and I'm just going to say it out loud, eminent domain would be another way. Like when the city is doing some of these trades with the federal government, like Poplar Point or some of these other, like, we don't need another baseball stadium, we don't need a soccer stadium, like, let's get part of that Armed Forces Retirement Homeland and build a community farm or land trust, or like what happened to the farm that used to be at St. Elizabeth's campus. Like, why can't we be growing food for ourselves again on government land? We don't control land in our own city. So like this conversation we're having is also within the context of like, we're not in 100% control, right? Like we barely have home rule.
100%. And definitely I do know that there was some community movement around, as there has been for years, around the Armed Forces Retirement Home and that land. And as Kendrick said in the chat, that it does have 8 unused greenhouses. So I want to pass back to Kate. I know that it's something that you've been working on and the Office of Urban Ag has been looking into, is both around accessing more, some folks asked in the chat, more district-owned land for the land lease program, as well as thinking about access to federal land. Wondering if you have any thoughts there, or just on what those of us on the call who might want to support that movement of federal land into urban ag here in the district.
Well, what I can tell you is that so far everyone tells me it's never going to happen and that it's impossible to secure National Park Service land. But for any of those who know me, I don't take no very well if I disagree with that no. So I too, this past summer, was on a bike ride from Anacostia Park up to Bladensburg, looking at all of this beautiful land. And I had this crazy vision about what would it look like to have a community farm that could be a farmer incubator that then, because you can't profit off of federal land, that money could then somehow, of sales of crops, go back to fund a land trust. So I'm actually trying to work with the Anacostia Park Community Collaborative, I believe that's their name, to ground source this program. I certainly don't want to assume that I have the solution for what is best for Anacostia Park, but what I want to do is better understand if this is something the community would get behind. I do have Director Wells' support in this area, so it is an interesting way to leverage some of that power there. I want to believe that what we all want for National Park Service land is in value, in similar value with the National Park Service as far as activating public land. I've heard that maybe they don't actually want to activate land in the way that I think they do. I'm not really sure. All that to say is it is something that I am trying to work on, but also do right through a community lens, not just in a top-down kind of way, liaising with governments behind the scenes.
And Kate, there was a question specifically about the district land lease program. I know that the farmers who will be on that land aren't on our call today, but can you talk a little bit about the last process and when we might expect another round?
Well, it's actually crazy that you would ask, because 7 years in the making, our first lease was signed today. So yes, it's kind of crazy. With that said, this is a really steep uphill battle. Gail's right. The city's not willing to give land over. It's something that, you know, I am an employee of the mayor, so I have to be very diplomatic in the way that I move forth ideas. And then I think the Urban Ag Working Group is actually a place where we might be able to really leverage a lot of the more progressive language around how we think about land ownership. I do think this is going to be, we're looking now at actually like statistics about dispossession of land, displacement, and framing that as like reparations that we need to address as a city. It can't just be about it can't just be about economic development for the city. It has to be about economic development for people who have been most disenfranchised from that economic development. With that said, the city does not want to give up land. The land that they are making available isn't great quality farming land, frankly, and it doesn't have any utilities. So there are a number of hurdles to this program that I really haven't quite figured out yet how to overcome. There are 4 sites that DGS, the district's like real estate management agency, 4 new sites that they've identified. What we learned the first time from this program is that community ownership is key. One of the sites engaged the community early on in the awardee selection process, and the other community was not engaged. And there is one site where the farm was successful and a lease is signed, and there is another that is no longer in the Urban Ag portfolio. So we are choosing a different model this time, going to the communities first, and then we're actually looking at a framework where we would tailor the specific RFPs to the type of community farm model that the neighborhood is looking for. Caroline's flowers are my time. So just so you know, my
yes, indeed. If you're wondering why I don't have leaks on hand, unfortunately. I want to end with one question for our panelists. We heard, and Gail and several others of you mentioned that, land is much more affordable. Farmland is much more affordable outside of the district. There are many things that would be easier farming outside of the district. And all of you have, at least for now, chosen to continue farming in the district. So I want to end with a question of what keeps you farming in DC? And take it as you will. I'm curious, and I will start with David.
I mean, like, what keeps us here is we love DC, and this community deserves to have everything. And like, we deserve to not only have good enough, but like the best. We have amazing farmers, we have amazing farms, we have the crops, we have the seeds, we have the will. We just don't have the money or the resources or the power. And yeah, what keeps us going is like love, and like other jobs, that's realistically like love and a second job.
Thanks for being real about that, David. Thank you. Kristof.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a native Washingtonian, and this is the only home I've ever known, and that's why I'm still here. My family lives here. There's not really another place that I can call my home. That's where I have this is where I have resources that allow me to do this day in and day out. So that's why I'm here.
Thanks, Kristof. What about you, Mary?
It's really just because this is where I live, and I've already invested so much in the farm. Now we're here to stay. And I've always had this vision for the farm that it would be located in a neighborhood, and that we would have a little farm shop, and that people could come and buy the fresh, fresh produce. And we finally have that. It's awesome. Like, I love that we are in the Trinidad neighborhood and we're open. We have a little farm shop, and you can just walk on up if you live there. And we have members of our CSA that come every week, and I can ride my bike to where I work. So those are the reasons.
Thanks, Mary. And what about you, Gail?
Same, what everyone else said. I love this city. I'm a transplant, but I've been here for more than half my life. And I'm really I feel connected to the city. This is my home. And I am still idealizing the idea of riding my bike to work, like Mary said. But also, after going into the 10th year, now I'm connected to that land. It's not that I want to just grow anywhere in DC. I have a relationship with that soil that I built. So I'm not going to leave that place and start again somewhere in DC. When I leave that place, I'll go somewhere else.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And thanks to our 4 panelists today and for sharing that. Our commitment as DSLBD and DOEE are to be able to support you in staying on that land, in being able to find land in the district, and being able to, as many folks have said in the chat, to be able to find access to markets, figure support you both on the business side and on the farming side between our 2 agencies. So we're looking forward to continuing these conversations, but I just want to invite everyone to give our panelists a big round of applause. It's awkward on Zoom, so feel free to briefly have lots of feedback, unmute yourself and give them some claps, clap on video, or do this weird WebEx clapping. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thanks for your time and for all you do for the city.
Thank you, hosts and panel, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight.
Take care and happy growing season.